Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to lie, I'm really surprised that you're all still here at 5 p.m. to listen to a talk about risk and compliance. I'm glad there is Red Bull outside. If you haven't got your Red Bull, it's just out there on the left. No, jokes aside, we have George here today, who's the head of risk and compliance, telling us about how Atlassian manages risk and compliance. George has a passion for information security and risk management with more than 20 years of experience in technology and financial industries, creating and leading various information system functional groups. He's in fact held so many scary titles and roles in his life that when he introduced himself to his team at Atlassian, they all thought they'd done something wrong. So he's here to talk to you about how we manage risk and compliance at Atlassian, so please welcome him to the stage.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm perfectly aware that I'm the last thing between you and the cocktails, but I'm kind of used to being in that situation. So I'll try to make it a little bit more interesting. Okay, so how does Atlassian manage risk and compliance? So before we dive into the topic, I just want to talk about our function, the risk and compliance function at Atlassian. So we have three major roles. We manage the compliance program, and that has two aspects. One is our internal compliance. Think of things like PCI, SOX, SOC 2, ISO, those things, our own compliance. We also have the external view of the world. In other words, what do we do as a company to help you manage your compliance? What kind of features we put in the tools? What kind of best practices we have in order to help you manage your own compliance. The second part is the business continuity and disaster recovery program. As a technology company, we have a strong focus on disaster recovery, especially with moving more and more into the cloud space. That is important, and of course the business continuity as everyone else. And also the enterprise risk management program. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, how we approach it. So really our mission is to help build trust, both internally and externally, and do it fast. Everybody nowadays wants to do it fast, so we also want to do it fast. So let me dive into the agile and compliance, because it's a really complicated relationship. It's not a straightforward one. So I assume that you all faced agile up to this point, either in the business environment or most likely in the technology environment. And there are a lot of reasons why we like the agile approach and all the things that surround the agile approach. I'm talking about DevOps, I'm talking about continuous deployment, all those things around the agile. So Harvard Business Review actually had a study. They used a survey from PwC, so it was a combined paper. And they determined that those are the 5 reasons why companies would like to deploy the agile approach. Reduces time to market, so the speed is very important. Improves quality and productivity. Increases employee satisfaction. That's actually a really strong reason for deploying agile. And reduces cost. It's a very adaptive approach to the environment, so it's really fast. I also did an informal study within Atlassian. Atlassian, as you know, is really heavy on agile. And by the way, we take an agile approach not only in terms of software development, but throughout the organization. A lot of business processes are following this approach as well. It needless to say that our projects are managed on an agile framework. So what our development manager said pretty much matches what the HBR discovered. We deliver value quickly, value to you. We focus on the stakeholders so we can follow closely where the market is going, what the stakeholders want, both internally and externally. Autonomy of the teams is also very important. Of course, continuous improvement and predictable cost and delivery. The last two have some caveats with them. So if you do it right, yes, you're going to achieve that continuous improvement, and you're going to have predictable cost and delivery within the time frame of a few sprints. But as opposed to waterfall, you cannot look too much in the future. But also details around agile. The bottom line is that companies really love Agile. There are a lot of benefits that you're getting from the Agile. Probably you're familiar with, sorry. Okay, too much clicking. Probably you're familiar with those 4 statements. That is the so-called Agile Manifesto. I would like to point your attention to the second part of each statement. So, we don't really like processes and tools. We're not big fans of documentation. Contracts, not that important. Plan, what is a plan? Okay, so next one is a meme that probably everyone has seen so far. That's a statement from one of the LinkedIn founders. If you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you launch too late. So put your traditional auditor cap. How do you feel about that? Okay? This is highly dynamic thing. It moves all over the place. It's very unstructured. I don't know what is going on. The documentation, maybe here, maybe there. I don't know what is happening there. It's moving really fast. It's growing up fast. That's my nightmare. If I'm a traditional auditor, I'll be crazy to look at this thing. It's going to drive me nuts. So we have this strange relationship. On one hand, we really like Agile. We would like the benefits. But on the other hand, doing risk and compliance, auditing something within the Agile space, that's really crazy. We were really thinking about that, and I would not claim that we solved the problem, but we found a way towards the solution. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, how we're managing risk and compliance in a heavy Agile/DevOps environment. So let's look at what are challenges. So highly dynamic, unpredictable, it's scaling fast. When we formulated our approach, we looked at certain principles to follow. And some of them are going to sound very familiar, up to a point that they sound like a cliche, but they're really important in the Agile space. They have a real meaning in the Agile space. Automate. Everybody talks about automation. How do we automate compliance? But you really have to think about in the Agile space, because that's the only way you'll be able to scale fast together with the rest of the environment. Manual processes, maybe it's a good way to kind of introduce them in the beginning, manual controls, but you have to move to automation as soon as possible. Leveraging existing processes. In the traditional audit and risk and compliance space, usually we come to the software developer and say, thou should do this, and they have to follow it. What we found was much more effective is to look through the environment and see what can we reuse, reutilize. Probably not at 100%. Probably we have to do something around it to adopt it for our needs, but there is always something already in the environment that we can use. Optimization, really important. Again, that's the only way you can scale fast. And I'm going to give some examples of how we optimize internally. And managing risk, that's another cliche. But if you think about it, for example, if we compare the waterfall with the Agile, it's just impossible for us to cover everything in the Agile space. So defining where those high risks and concentrating on managing those high risks becomes even more important. So we're a collaboration company. It starts with a team. When we put together our function, the risk and compliance function, we thought a lot about how to structure the team and how to deploy it. The first requirement was that we have to be really closely aligned with the business. Our team members are embedded within the business teams. And when I say business team, I mean development, IT, HR, finance, ecosystem, whatever you come up, marketing, sales, whatever it is, our people are really closely embedded with the team. They sit on the operational meetings, they sit at the morning stand-ups, they sit at their planning, they look at their strategy, so they know exactly what is happening within that team. They're viewed as a member of the team. We have a wide range of skills, because each of our members of the risk and compliance team, they do risk and compliance, they do business continuity and disaster recovery. So they're the go-to person for that team. So they have to know everything. They should be able to answer a question from a DR space and at the same time advise on some control, how this control should be implemented, or do a risk assessment, help the business unit conduct their risk assessment. So really wide range of skills. At the same time, we structured our team as a matrix organization. So each of the team members is embedded within the certain team. They know everything about that team, but they also become a subject matter expert in a particular field. So a team member, let's say, works with IT, but at the same time, they're our in-house domain expert on PCI. So if anybody else on the team have a really complicated question, or we have to figure out how to drive the strategy around PCI or SOX or something else, that is the person responsible for that standard. So they're kind of putting everything together. So it is really important to have an intimate knowledge of the business team that you're working with, business teams. And business, again, that's technology and actual business teams. We also took the approach of integrated compliance, and I'm going to give you an example. But first, I would like to talk about the way we solved a very common problem with change management. So I took this example for change management because it's a common control. Whatever standard you have to implement, there is a change management. It is across the board. It's a key control. So let's look at the traditional change management. We file a ticket. May I do X? And by the way, this is pretty much common for whether you're changing a software, you're deploying a new system, or you're doing a change in the configuration of the system or the network. It's a pretty much similar approach. So file a ticket, may I do X, describing exactly what I'm doing. Then there is a review board. A group of people sit together, look at all the changes, say, yeah, we can do this, we're not going to do that, we're going to postpone this, and so on and so forth. And at some point you get an approval of the ticket that, yes, you're going to make the change. Then you schedule the change. On Friday night, come change the configuration, deploy the new system. The whole weekend is gone. And then deployment is done. Somebody has to come after you and say, yeah, that really happened. They actually switched the system. This is the new configuration. It works as expected. How do you audit this thing? Think about it. I have to find all the changes that happened. How do I do that? Then I have to find the tickets associated with those changes. Then I have to look at the decisions that the review board made. It's a nightmare from audit perspective. From a deployment perspective, from the business perspective, this will take at least 2 weeks. Think about it. To get this review board together, and if somebody is doing continuous deployment, I'm killing that group. They cannot even function with this type of approach. We said, okay, that's what is the traditional change management. What can we do internally? How can we optimize this process? Or maybe get rid of it? So we went to the teams, to the deployment, to the development teams, and said, guys, what are you actually doing? How do you deploy software? And it turned out that they do peer reviews. I write some code, and by the way, we manage our changes in Bitbucket as well. So whether we deploy code or we deploy configuration changes, we do it through Bitbucket. So our configurations are in Bitbucket. We use the same approach. So what they do is they write the code or they make a change in the configuration and they ask someone to, hey, have a look. Does that make sense? Is it all right? Then they push it to Bamboo, and we have these tests, quality assurance tests, that are running against the code and testing for certain things. And this is what we call green build. Probably you're familiar with the concept of green build. It means that, okay, all the tests are green, you can go deploy. Then we sign the package and we keep it on Bamboo. And when we have to deploy it, the deployment engineer actually clicks on the button, this thing goes into production, boom, done. What happens was the peer review was not 100% enforced. And he said, Bitbucket gave us that opportunity. So from now on, every time when you deploy the code, somebody has to review that code. That's our review board. And by the way, it happens with the same speed as deployment. So I just have to find another engineer who is versed in what I'm doing to look at the code or the configuration change and say, yep, that makes sense. The review done. And some of the internal groups that are dealing with more high-risk areas, they actually require 2 peer reviews. The other beauty of this approach is that it helps us with our role management. Because if I'm engineer, let's say on Bitbucket, I deploy code for Bitbucket, I don't necessarily need an engineer from the Bitbucket team to review my code. Yes, if I'm doing something in the Bitbucket core, yes, definitely I'm going to pick some of my colleagues who knows what I'm doing to review my code. But if I'm doing something on the analytics side, I may pick up somebody from marketing who knows better the analytics to review that code. So that gives me the flexibility to pick the right expert within the organization to review my code. Then, with the green build, we come up with a signed package. The engineer, the deployment engineer, cannot deploy unsigned packages. They cannot go around the system, which with the traditional process, it is possible to go directly to the system and deploy something. In our case, no, they cannot. We deploy only signed packages. It took a while for our auditors to come on board with this approach, and that opens a whole different topic, which is how do you bring the auditors along? Because inevitably you're going to come up with this alternative, agile approach to compliance that your auditors are initially not comfortable with because they just don't understand it. They're used to see what is on the left, not what is on the right. That doesn't necessarily mean that this thing on the right is bad. Actually, it took us a while, but when the light bulb came up, they really liked this thing. They said that this control is actually stronger than the traditional one. They loved it, and they started talking to other customers of theirs to deploy a similar approach. So you have to be really close with the auditors. You have to kind of bring them together, make sure that they're comfortable with your approach. So having this close relationship with the auditor becomes even more necessity within the agile space. So we took a process that was already there, we optimized it, we built upon it, and we automated it. So this is a completely automated process. It can work in a continuous deployment space. There is nothing that can stop this thing. It doesn't introduce delay in the system. So if you want to know more about our controls, we have our ISO 27001. A lot of you have been asking about it. Yes, we have ISO 27001. We also have SOC 2 Type 1 for Bitbucket, Jira, and Confluence. Bitbucket is available right now. Jira and Confluence is coming later. But we have those reports. You can go to our trust site. By the way, we put together a trust site. So if you go to atlassian.com/trust, we're talking about compliance, security, privacy, and there is a link to those reports where you can kind of dive deeper into each of the controls associated with those standards. And tomorrow there is going to be a session from one of the PMs in Bamboo, who is going to talk about deep details of how exactly that process works. We're not technical experts, but he can give you the gory details around that process. So the next thing is we're looking at a lot of standards, right? And this is just, I would say this is a standard set of standards for a company to deploy. So you have SOX, you have NIST, FedRAMP maybe, ISO, PCI of course. There are a lot of standards. So if I have to deploy a control set for each one of them, and I have to audit for each one of them, then one of my most expensive resource, software developers, are going to be in perpetual audit all the time. They're going to hate me. They won't be able to do their regular work because I'm bringing auditors to ask them the same questions over and over. So we came up with Atlassian Control Framework. It is a known concept. I'm not putting any trademarks on this thing. If you're familiar with the Unified Control Framework, that is very similar concept. So we optimized our control portfolio. So you saw change management. This is the change management that we do for SOX, for PCI, for SOC, for ISO. It is the same thing. It's the same control. So controls that we put in place, we're trying to reuse as much as possible. The benefit here is that we reduce the audit burden because we test the control once, done with it. The other thing is that if we expand the scope of that control, the new teams are already familiar with it. They can talk to other engineers, for example, and say, oh, you're already doing peer review green build, our change management. No problem, we can do it as well. that reduces the business involvement. So it lowers the audit cost. The other thing that we are trying to do is to align as many of the audits together as possible. So we test once and we cover multiple standards. The approach is expandable and scalable, because when we add a new standard, we do the mapping. We try to find out what can we reuse from the controls that are already in place. And it turns out that we built already I would say, a critical mass. So adding a new standard is a marginal effort for us. There are some weird things that we have to do with with every standard, but in general, it's a marginal effort. And then the question becomes, okay, this Atlassian control framework sounds really nice. How are we going to do that? What is the tool that we are going to use to affect that? You'd be surprised how many companies are still using Excel and Word to manage their control portfolio. Their GRC tools are essentially Excel and Word. I'm sure that pretty much all of you have been, if you've been in the risk and compliance space, at some point in your life you used Excel with a whole bunch of controls and you used Word for your narratives. I'm not saying it's impossible, it is possible, but we're in the 21st century. There must be something better than this. Then we looked at specialized tools, and there's some really, really good specialized tools. I guess everybody's familiar with Archer, really good tool for risk and compliance management. There's some open source tools like OpenGRC. It's actually free, you can download it, you can put it together. We also talked to some friends within the Silicon Valley and said, okay guys, what are you doing for risk and compliance? What are the tools that you use? They showed us their tool. And then we had an epiphany, because those specialized tools are tough to deploy, and buying the licenses is not the end of your cost. You usually need an army of consultants to kind of keep them going on. And sometimes, quite often, they're part of a big ERM tool. So it becomes kind of unwieldy. So our epiphany was that we can use Jira and Confluence. We already have those things. And the thing is that in Atlassian, we use Jira and Confluence for pretty much everything. If I have to engage a contractor, I file a ticket that goes to the legal team, and the legal team works off the queue, right? So it is there. Essentially, what we did was we took vanilla Jira. None of us is an expert in Jira. None of us is a Jira admin. We just know how to use it. So we took Jira, either in the cloud or the server, it doesn't matter, Jira. We took Confluence, and I'll tell you why we're using both of them, Jira and Confluence. Several people who know what they're doing, that is important. Lots of coffee and pizza. My guys love pizza. I don't know why, but they love pizza, so ton of pizza. You can spice it up with Jira Service Desk. So what we found was that you can do pretty much everything without the JSD, without Jira Service Desk, but Jira Service Desk gives you this nice front end to the customers, internal customers, and also can help with the scale in a way that currently in Atlassian, everyone can file a finding, everyone can file a risk. So essentially, we're crowdsourcing our risk and compliance through Jira Service Desk. So you can go without it, but strongly recommend it. So it took us about a week, really, to come up with the design and the model and to implement it. And all we've done is some custom Jira tickets, type tickets, and custom workflows around those tickets. So it's not out of this world science. Then in Confluence, we put some templates. That's it. And we took the agile approach. We put it together probably about 2 years ago. And we started using it and improving it and using it and improving it. And pretty much the entire risk and compliance currently is managed with Jira and Confluence. And we are actually looking for some things outside of it. So let me give you a few examples of how we utilize it. So this is essentially the GRC tool, a high-level overview of the GRC tool. So each of the boxes is a type of issue. So we decided that those are, so to say, compliance objects. So every issue is a compliance object. And each of those objects go through a life cycle. So we have an object of type risk. And by the way, we have 4 levels of risks. We have enterprise, business unit, process, and sub-process level of risk. So we have that hierarchy. So we have risks. We have control objectives, control activities, control performance, findings, remediation. I mean, you're familiar with those things. If you're in the risk and compliance space, you're familiar with those things. So you get one of those and you create a Jira ticket of this type. And then you can utilize things like owner. So I have the control owner, I have the control activity owner. I have assignee who actually does the control activity. I have a due date. So if there is a remediation, I have a due date. And that gives me all the internal reporting from Jira. I can utilize that. This is a life cycle, an example of a life cycle of a finding. So as I mentioned, we use Jira Service Desk. So if somebody sees something in the environment that doesn't look right, either the control doesn't perform well, or there is a risk somewhere in the environment, or something doesn't look right, they can fire a finding. And that finding goes through this cycle. By the way, the auditors, they also use that. When they find something in our controls, they use that to file a finding. So we verify it, we decide, okay, we're going to address it, we're not going to address it, then goes into remediation, we verify it's remediated, and then goes through the cycle again. And this is where the real power of Jira and Confluence kicks in, the linkages. So this is an example of a control activity. So this control activity had a finding against it, and then there is a remediation associated with it. Because of the linkages, I can look at the control activity and say, show me all the findings that I had against that, and what is the stage of the remediation against those things. And I can have one remediation against multiple findings. I can have one remediation against multiple controls. Because of the linkages, I can see all of that. And I can link outside. So for example, as I mentioned in Atlassian, we use Jira pretty much for everything. Developers, they work off of the queue. So they have a queue with bugs, improvements, functionality, different stuff. I can link to their own queue. So they see a remediation activity in their queue. They have no idea that it's coming from, actually, if they read it, they'll find out that it's coming from risk and compliance, but they don't treat it in any other different way than the rest of the tasks that they have in the backlog, which is really, really helpful because it doesn't create this, probably you're all familiar with this bias of, oh, risk and compliance, we'll deal with that later. Because they treat it the same way as they treat bugs and feature improvements. And then the reports, actually on the left side where you see the heat map, that is a plugin that we developed for us for Jira. And it's very simple to put the finding against that plugin and creates a nice heat map that the board and the executives love. It's really nice, a lot of colors. So we started expanding. We kind of liked the concept. It started gaining momentum, so we started expanding it. Another thing that we use this concept for is attestations. As you probably, everybody else, we're using more and more cloud providers, SaaS providers. So we have to manage a whole bunch of attestations, SOC 1, SOC 2 reports, PCI, and so on and so forth. All of those are issues in Jira. So I can look at, I have a view in Jira that shows me all the attestations that my service providers are giving me. And from the due date, I can see where is the renewal of that attestation. So I can immediately say, oh, you know what, Amazon, I need your new SOC 2 report for review. And there are life cycles. So this is a current attestation, this attestation on the review, this attestation is active. So all of those are in Jira. What we found was that Jira is really good for workflow management. It's awesome for workflow management. But if you want to have some more rich documents with diagrams and text and all those kind of things, Jira is not the right spot. That's where Confluence shines in. So even for some of the control narratives, we keep them in Confluence. more complicated, more rich control narratives are in Confluence with the corresponding Jira ticket to manage the workflow for that particular narrative. So that's how we manage attestations. Policies. This was actually the first thing that we put in addition to the regular GRC. So we keep the policies in Confluence for the same reason. Rich text document, really nice, a lot of comments, so we can see what people wanted from a policy, what questions they asked. The life cycle of the policy is within Jira. So for each Confluence document, we have the corresponding Jira issue. And we have policy exceptions. Again, they're behind Jira Service Desk, so anybody in the company can fire a policy exception. That policy exception is a Jira issue that is linked to the policy type of issue. So I can look at a policy and I can see all the exceptions associated with that policy, where they are. Are they approved? Are they expired? What it is. So when we do the enterprise risk management, when we do the review of the risks within the environment, I can look at the policy and say, hey, you know what? That policy has 20 exceptions that have been approved. First of all, maybe it's a time for review of that policy. But second, let me look again at my risk acceptance in that space. So everything kind of ties together. Another area that we used for our audit this year was PBCs, the evidence that the auditors require. So every year, auditors come and do the audit and they say, okay, show me that you did this, show me evidence that you did that, give me a screenshot from here, give me a log from here, all those kind of things. So audits for us are subtasks within the control test. If you remember, we have the issue type control test. So we either describe it in Confluence or we keep it in Jira, but there is a process of how to test the control. So every year we have subtasks under those issues. So I can see all the subtasks for 2015, all the subtasks for 2016, all the subtasks for 2017. So in each individual audit cycle, I can look at what the auditors are looking at, what kind of documentation they asked for, and I can see when I provided that documentation exactly what I provided in the linked PBCs, so I can prepare. I can go to the teams in advance and say, hey, you know what, the audit cycle started, and by the way, this is the view of the things that I'll be asking for. It's in Jira, and everybody loves that. And of course, the findings go in Jira and the remediations are also linked there. And now, the last one that we put was the risk type. So as I mentioned, we have a risk issue type and we have a hierarchy of risks. So when we talk to the executives, when we talk to the board in terms of what are the enterprise risks, because of those linkages, we have a really good view of what is happening and why we deem that this is a high risk. Because we can go down deep, down to the process level and sub-process level if necessary. So we can say, this is an enterprise risk that we are concerned about because there are another 5 departments that have similar things, and those 5 departments have processes that also have this risk in them. So it's a really powerful tool from a data perspective, very convincing. And the other thing is Jira Service Desk is helping us crowdsourcing those risks. Speaking of crowdsourcing, we have this model put together in the cloud. So the website is riskmanagement.atlassian.net. And we started working with some of our customers, some of our partners, start putting together controls, control objectives, some of the control activities there. So essentially we are trying to crowdsource the GRC. So if you want to have a look at it, play with it, see how it works, it's very interesting. It's really like a demo. So the solution is pretty easy. Essentially we are a site within a Confluence. We are a project within Jira. Very simple. There is no necessary a lot of development. I mean, the sky is the limit. You can put a lot of stuff if you want to, but just to start, you can start with vanilla Jira and vanilla Confluence. It's very low cost. If you already have Jira and Confluence, your delta is 0. Essentially, you need GRC experts to help you put it in place, so there is no license involved in that. Very integrated within the environment. I was talking about the specialized risk and GRC tools. Yes, we have connections with those. There are drivers that allow you API calls from one to the other. but it is not on the level of the integration that we have with the rest of the environment because we're using Jira and Confluence. So it's really highly integrated. If you already use Jira and Confluence, really highly integrated. It's very expandable, so adding a new standard, it's a matter of putting together those issues, relinking them, making sure that they're in place, and you're ready to go. It's very scalable. We can add as many standards as we want, and every other standard is getting easier and easier to add because you already have the baseline. So this is what we have so far. The next thing that we are working on, and again, it is linked within the GRC and Jira and Confluence, is what we call the trust management system. So what we noticed was that every standard, so let's say take COSO, SOX, take SOC 2, take ISO 27001. Each one of them described some kind of a risk management system with its own components, like governance structures. If you think about it, SOX require that you have some kind of a committee that approves the controls. You have to check those controls on a periodic basis. You have to review your policies. Same thing with SOC 2. If you look at the SOC 2, you have to have some kind of a governance structure that determines what is the direction for the program. Then you have to have working groups that actually implement those things. So there are commonalities between the risk management frameworks that they're deploying. And our question was, okay, can we abstract these commonalities and come up with some kind of a risk management structure that satisfies all those and potentially future standards that we would like to implement? So that is what we call Atlassian Trust Management System. So we're abstracting the risk management. So policy management program, for example, we already did that. So policy management is the same across the board. We're working, the control management is also done. Auditing and assurance, we are almost there. Now we're looking at the governance structures that we have. Because, for example, we have a business continuity and disaster recovery committee that deals with the space of business continuity and disaster recovery. We have the audit committee that deals with the SOX related standards. So we're thinking about how we can optimize in that space as well. So, in summary, I don't think we completely solved the problem, but I think we're on the way there to solving the problem with risk and compliance within the agile DevOps space. Jira and Confluence turned out to be really good tools for solving the problem. And you can see that this is a problem that on one side is a business problem, on the other side is a technical problem. So it lands very well for that. Optimizing the control framework, really, really, really important. That reduces the cost and burden on the teams. And the trust management system, we put a lot of faith that this is going to happen. We already see indications that this is helping us optimize the environment and how we manage risk and compliance. One thing that we've done is we put together a compliance community. So if you go to community.atlassian.com, under the so I think there are communities based on products, and there are general communities. Under the general communities, there is a compliance community. Please put your questions there, opinions. Tear this presentation to shreds. I would love if you can comment on this thing. And any kind of input that you have, we really would like to start this compliance community and talk about how we can optimize. And Jira and Confluence, those are the tools. Let's think through about people and processes as well. So how we put everything together, because it's a very interesting problem. Thank you.